I watched every Frankenstein movie, ever. With Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein movie coming up with actors like Oscar Isaac and Jacob Elordi in it, there's a lot of talk about Frankenstein right now. Which led me on a quest to answer a question that had kind of popped in my head, which is, why are there so many adaptations of the book Frankenstein by Mary Shelley? Now let me be clear, there are obviously tons and tons and tons of movies featuring Frankenstein's monster. Stuff like Alvin and the Chipmunks Meet Frankenstein. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about direct adaptations of the book. So I wanted to watch all of the different adaptations with a few questions in mind. Is each adaptation different? If so, what is different about them? How many adaptations are just Frankenstein but modern day? How many are period pieces? Are they all just the same movie? I mean, they are all based on the same book, the same story, the same characters. So are they all just the same? Is there one adaptation that is clearly better than the rest? Is there one that is worse than the rest? I mean, they're the same book, they're the same story. How can one be so much clearly better and one so clearly worse? So that is what we are going to find out. Now, before we jump into watching the movie adaptations, starting with 1931's Frankenstein by Universal, let's do a quick summary of the book that all of these movies are based on. The book is structured as a series of letters written by a sea captain named Robert Walton, who was on this journey headed to the North Pole. But during his journey, he gets trapped in some ice and he actually meets Victor Frankenstein. He brings Victor aboard his ship and Victor starts to tell him the story of his life. Victor begins his story talking about his childhood, growing up with his cousin Elizabeth and his best friend Henry. After his charming childhood, he leaves to go to college. While at college, where he is pursuing a career as a doctor, he becomes obsessed with trying to discover the secret of life. And after several years, he finally figures it out. He spends months assembling a body with different body parts that he's found at graveyards and stuff. And one night, he brings his creation to life. But the second that he sees what he has created, he is filled with disgust. He flees, he goes back home to try and avoid the creature that he had brought to life. And the reason he's trying to escape is because the creature that he created has escaped his apartment. Victor Frankenstein is back home with his family and he learns that his younger brother has been killed. And Victor actually catches a glimpse of his monster nearby, where he puts two and two together and realizes that his monster, the monster that he created, strangled and killed his little brother. A young woman gets blamed for his brother's death, which causes Victor to feel even more guilt, because not only did he create the creature that killed his little brother, but now, a young woman is going to be put to death for a murder that she did not commit, because it was committed by a creature that he created. Victor runs away, he goes on vacation, where the monster follows him and confronts him. The monster tells Victor, because the monster can talk now, he tells Victor that he did in fact accidentally kill Victor's little brother. And the monster pleads with Victor. He says, please be understanding, and he actually asks Victor to create him a friend. He wants a partner because he is so lonely. And Victor eventually decides to follow through and create a partner for the monster. Victor starts the creation of the new monster, then realizes what he's doing is evil and despicable and he shouldn't have done it the first time, let alone do it again, and so he decides to destroy it. Now this causes his original monster to absolutely lose it, and the monster vows revenge on Victor. The monster, to get his revenge, kills Victor's best friend, who is named Henry, which causes Victor to get blamed for the murder of his best friend. Victor gets acquitted of the crime and he goes back home where he plans to marry Elizabeth. Yes, Elizabeth is his cousin. This is back in the day. Victor and Elizabeth get married, and on their wedding night, the monster kills Elizabeth, which causes Victor to then vow revenge on the monster. Victor vows that he will spend the rest of his life hunting down the creature that he created and get his revenge, which leads him to the North Pole, where he meets the ship captain that we started this story with. A few days after Victor meets the ship captain, Victor ends up dying from illness. The monster, the creature, visits Victor's body and weeps over it. The monster, suffering the grief of losing his father, his creator, decides he is going to go to the northmost ice and die. So there you go. That is a very quick summary of the book that all of these movies are based on. So now that we have got the story refreshed in our minds, we can begin watching the first movie. Frankenstein 1931 is the first major adaptation of Frankenstein. I say first major adaptation because there were some silent film versions previous. Immediately, the difference between this film adaptation and the original book is that the movie is only 1 hour long. Now, this movie does have a sequel that pretty much picks up right where the first movie ends. So if you combine those two movies together, it kind of makes one adaptation of the book. But as a rule, we're not going to be including sequels in this investigation. So we're only going to be doing the first movie. I mention this because due to the movie being only 1 hour, there's not a lot of time for this to be a complete adaptation of the novel. In this film, we jump in right in the middle. Dr. Frankenstein is collecting body parts from a graveyard for his creation. Here are some of the key differences in this movie that stray from the book. In this version, Dr. Frankenstein's first name is not Victor. His name is Henry Frankenstein. Now I know what you're saying. Chase, I thought there was already a Henry in the original book. It's Victor's best friend. You're right. And there is still that best friend character in this movie. Can you take 2 guesses to what that best friend's name is? That's right, the best friend's name is Victor. Why did they flip-flop those 2 names? I don't know. I actually just looked it up for you real quick. The leading character of Mary Shelley's book, Dr. Victor Frankenstein, was renamed Henry for the movie because it was decided that Victor would sound too severe and unfriendly to American audiences at the time. Probably has something to do with it sounding Russian, if I had to guess. This adaptation also sees one of the biggest differences that we will see in almost every single adaptation from here on out, and that is the inclusion of an assistant character for Dr. Frankenstein. In this one, the assistant's name is Fritz. Fritz is an original character who is not in the original book. The movie adaptation also, all of the kills in this movie are very different than the kills that take place in the book. In the movie, the monster's first kill is the assistant character, Fritz, instead of Dr. Frankenstein's younger brother, as it is in the novel. In the movie, the monster also kills an old professor, a little girl that he accidentally drowns trying to play with her, and then I think he kills like a townsperson or 2. And that's pretty much it for the kills that take place in the movie. Which brings me to the biggest difference between the book and the movie, which is the ending. In the book, the monster kills Elizabeth on the wedding night, but in the movie, the monster does not kill Elizabeth. In fact, it doesn't really kill anybody at the end. All of the townspeople mob together with their torches and pitchforks, and they hunt down the monster and kill him. The movie kind of ends with this one-on-one showdown between Frankenstein's monster and Dr. Frankenstein himself at the top of this windmill. Frankenstein throws Victor off the top of it. He survives, and the townspeople burn the whole mill down with Frankenstein inside. Then Frankenstein and Elizabeth live happily ever after. Now, I will say that the sequel of this movie does go deeper into a different part of the book. You know, it talks about the creation of the partner for the monster, which you get in the book, you know, but we're not going to be really talking about that. I think that this is a really great Frankenstein movie, even though it strays from the original book. This movie is going to be kind of the goalpost for all of the adaptations from here on out, being like, hey, they took the story and they made a very entertaining movie based on it. It does not have to be a page-by-page direct adaptation in order for it to be good and entertaining. It just needs to be a good movie, you know? I'm very excited to jump into our next Frankenstein adaptation, which sees us jumping all the way from 1931 to 1957, with a movie called The Curse of Frankenstein. The Curse of Frankenstein is the exact reason that I even wanted to make this video. This is a movie that is based on the same exact book as the last movie that we just watched, 1931's Frankenstein, and yet I feel like I watched two extremely different films. For example, in this adaptation, Victor Frankenstein, he is not called Henry in this adaptation, we see Victor start off the movie in jail. And he is telling his story to a priest. Now, this is a lot like the book where Frankenstein is telling his life story to the sea ship captain, but in this version, it's a priest talking to him in prison. The movie takes us all the way back to Victor's childhood years, where when he is a teenager, he meets his cousin Elizabeth for the very first time. Then we see him get this new tutor. His name is Paul Crimp. Now, in this version of the story, there is no best friend named Henry. This tutor slash mentor kind of takes the role of the best friend character. We see Victor and Paul learning and experimenting and starting to slowly discover their own fascination for the secret of life, which leads to them resurrecting a dead dog. The success of resurrecting the dog leads them to go and start gathering body parts for a human version, but Paul decides that this is too much and quits. And he pleads with Victor that Victor should also quit. But Victor refuses. Now, it's no secret that the whole point of the story of Frankenstein is that the monster is not the monster of the story at all. Humans are the monster in that story. In particular, Dr. Frankenstein is the monster in the story. This movie takes that idea and really runs with it. Although this is a horror film, it feels a lot more like a drama. And in this version, Dr. Frankenstein is the big scary monster, almost like a psychological thriller. In this movie adaptation, we only see the monster, the creature, kill one person, and it is only implied. But we see Victor Frankenstein murder someone with his bare hands, kills another person by trapping them in the room with the monster, and he shoots his wife. She doesn't die, but still pretty crazy. He also does some other crazy stuff in this adaptation. He gets his maid pregnant while he's married to his wife. So, it's very clear that he is a bad guy in this film. In the first film that we watched, we saw that Dr. Frankenstein's ambition led him to creating a monster. But in this version, his ambition causes him to become evil. He becomes a monster. So let's break down some of the bigger changes that this movie has from the book. We've already mentioned a few, like there's no Henry, Dr. Frankenstein kills a man. The man that Frankenstein kills, the doctor, it's a professor who has a genius brain, and so Dr. Frankenstein kills him to get his brain for his creature. And so he just pushes him off the banister in his house. Another interesting change is that the monster actually gets brought back to life twice in this version. He, of course, gets brought back to life with the initial experiment, but then Paul shoots the monster in the face, killing it, and then Victor resurrects him once again. It's like a twice-baked potato, They're like, we brought him back once, let's do it again. The ending of this movie is probably the biggest change from the book, which is something we've seen in both adaptations now. In this version, the monster is on the roof chasing down Elizabeth. The monster had broken out of his chains. So they're both on the roof, the monster grabs Elizabeth, but before the monster can even do anything, Dr. Frankenstein just starts popping off and just shooting at their general direction. Both of the bullets that Dr. Frankenstein shoots at their direction hits his wife. He doesn't even graze the monster. Then he throws an oil lamp at the monster, which causes the monster to be engulfed in flames. And then the monster, dies. Dr. Frankenstein is then arrested for all of the murders that happen in this movie, which he tries to explain wasn't him, it was the monster, which isn't true. But there's no trace of the monster, and his friend Paul denies any knowledge of the incident. In fact, Paul and his wife Elizabeth, who survived getting shot, they both say they don't know anything about the monster. So Dr. Frankenstein is found guilty and his head's chopped off by a guillotine. And then Paul and Elizabeth live happily ever after. So that's cool. In this version, not only does Elizabeth survive, but she ends up happily ever after with, the best friend. Very different movie, still very good movie. I think I did enjoy 1931's adaptation better, but that doesn't mean that I did not like this one. In fact, I really liked some of the changes that this one made from the original story. I liked watching Dr. Frankenstein become more and more evil due to his ambition. The monster had a really fun design, and the monster was played by Christopher Lee. So, that was dope. I'm not really like ranking or rating these different adaptations. It's just kind of a, hey, this was a good adaptation of the story, So far we're 2 for 2 for just good adaptations. I Was a Teenage Frankenstein. This movie sees Professor Frankenstein giving a lecture to some colleagues about reanimating dead tissue. Someone in the room calls his theory dumb, so this whole version of Frankenstein is about ego. Well, most versions are about ego, but this one is about like the ego of proving a coworker wrong. Now, the thing about Professor Frankenstein is that he is actually a descendant of Baron Frankenstein, who in this adaptation is the original Frankenstein who created the original monster. But Professor Frankenstein is going to do what Dr. Frankenstein couldn't do, which is create a monster for good. He's still going to bring someone back from the dead, but he plans to do it for like the good of humanity, Side note, I do really love how a lot of Frankenstein movies use that kind of plot device. Like, oh, this movie is about Dr. Frankenstein's great-great-great-great-grandson, who's also named Dr. Frankenstein. It feels like a fun way of capitalizing on the story that everyone already knows. It's like, hey, you remember that story of Frankenstein and his monster? Yeah. Well, that all happened, but this is like 300 years later. That was the old Frankenstein. We've got a new Frankenstein, and he's got some new ideas. And they end up doing the same thing, but this is different. Anyway, conveniently, some teenagers die in a car accident at the exact moment that Professor Frankenstein decides that he needs to start gathering body parts. So Professor Frankenstein takes one of the teenage bodies from out there on the street and carries them up to his office. Before the cops can show up to the scene and figure out that they got dead teenagers out here. In this version, the professor has a colleague who is reluctantly helping him with the experiment. So that is playing the role of the assistant character and the best friend character, kind of. Another side note about this movie is that it came out the same exact year as the last Frankenstein adaptation that we just watched, Curse of Frankenstein. But you can tell that this one had a lot cheaper of a budget. And this movie was made in only 4 weeks, so, you can really see the dip in quality. Oh, by the way, in this version, Professor Frankenstein is in America, but he comes from England. And that, is a major plot point in this story, is that the professor comes from England. The actor does not use an English accent, not even close to one, actually. Professor Frankenstein does have a love interest, however. Her name is not Elizabeth, her name is Margaret. And instead of getting all of the different body parts from graveyards and stuff, Professor Frankenstein just keeps finding dead teenagers. Thus, the name of the movie, I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, which I feel is a little misleading. Because Frankenstein is the doctor, or in this case, the professor. And the monster in this movie is the one who's actually a teenager. But based off the title, you would think that the doctor is a teenager, right? Am I crazy? Where this movie lacks in, overall quality, it makes up for it with some pretty fun moments. Like, Professor Frankenstein has a chute in his office that he can throw body parts into, and he's got a little alligator down there that chomps it all up. You know how I said that he keeps conveniently finding teenage dead bodies laying around? turns out one of the big plot points here is that the high school track team gets in a big accident. Another really funny thing is like kind of the major plot of the monster that gets created is since he's a teenager, he just cares about how his face looks, which is really disgusting, by the way. So, you know, that's pretty on brand for a teenager. I think that was a pretty solid choice. Anyway, Professor Frankenstein gives the monster a new face, a very handsome one, which he loves. But what doesn't make the monster happy is that Frankenstein is going to have to kill him and take him back apart so that he can ship the pieces over to England where he can get back home and then reanimate him once again. So the monster doesn't like that and he attacks the professor. And he attacks the professor, throws him down the alligator chute, it kills him. Then the police shows up, the teenage monster electrocutes himself, killing him. And this is the end of the movie, but it is super cool. It's like a really cool moment because this is the only scene in the entire movie that was shot in color. The whole movie's in black and white, and then as the monster is electrocuted, it turns to color. It's like the Wizard of Oz, you know? You leave in Kansas, you get electrocuted. And I really love the irony that in the original story and most of the adaptations, electricity is what brings the monster to life. But in this version, electricity is what kills the monster. So, yeah, that's really all I've got to say about that one.
Frankenstein, 1970. Boris Karloff as Frankenstein, 1970.
Frankenstein, 1970. That is the name of the movie, not the year that it came out. The movie actually came out in 1958, but it was titled 1970 because they wanted it to be set in the future. So this movie is set in the distant future, you know, the 1970s. And this is the first adaptation that really makes some huge drastic changes to the source material. Now, I will say in this adaptation, Boris Karloff returns. Boris Karloff played the original Frankenstein monster in the 1931 adaptation that we watched at the beginning of this video. But in this version, Boris Karloff is not the monster, no. Boris Karloff is Dr. Frankenstein. However, this Dr. Frankenstein is the descendant of the original Dr. Frankenstein, the one who first created the monster. And in this movie, this Dr. Frankenstein still lives in the family castle that the original Dr. Frankenstein lived in. This is a castle that has run through the family for generations. Anyway, Boris Karloff's version of Dr. Frankenstein, the descendant of the original Dr. Frankenstein, is renting out the castle to a film crew who are making a cheesy movie based on his ancestors' original monster. That was like a historic event for the world, I guess. It's like their 9/11. And I know I just talked about this, but I do really love how they use, like all of these adaptations just kind of use the Universal movie as a prequel. They're like, hey, you remember that movie? Yeah, all of that happened. This is different though. In this version, we are still following Victor Frankenstein. However, his ancestor, who was the original creator of the monster, was called Dr. Richard Frankenstein. So, in this version, Victor Frankenstein is not the first person to recreate life. But you best believe that he's going to be next. In this version, it's actually very different. We see Dr. Frankenstein hunting down and killing all of the different people staying at his castle so that he could use them for body parts. And I think that that's actually a really cool difference. It's almost more like a slasher film, where the villain of this movie is the doctor himself. He's killing them off one by one, almost like a Michael Myers or a Freddy Krueger or a Ghostface character. The doctor is, not the monster. Then, of course, he gets the body parts, he creates the monster turns on him, and he dies. And then the monster also dies. So, once again, while the original book, the point is that Dr. Frankenstein is the real monster, this one takes it even a step further, even more than Curse of the Frankenstein, where we saw him, you know, become a killer. In this version, he's literally the monster that is hunting down people in the dark. Another large change is the theme and the reasoning behind why Dr. Frankenstein is recreating life. Typically, it's about ego, and this one is no different. It is about ego, but a different type of ego. The reason that Dr. Frankenstein is recreating life is because he wants to create a sort of son figure that will carry on the Frankenstein name. So it's the ego of wanting to continue his family name and legacy which causes him to go insane. And this one definitely plays with the theme of generational curses as well. Not being able to break the chain of monster making that his family has dealt with for generations. The theme of generational curses is also a major theme in the Young Frankenstein parody film starring Gene Wilder. We won't be watching that one for this video because although it does technically adapt the story, it is more of a spoof or a parody of the 1931 movie instead of being about the book. But it is a really awesome movie. I highly recommend everyone watch Young Frankenstein. Blackenstein. Blackenstein was made due to the success of the Blackula movie, which was a blaxploitation film about Dracula. Came out in 1972. Now, Blackenstein came out the following year in 1973, but was not as well received. Even now, pop culture has kind of forgotten about Blackenstein, but you will still see Blackula show up quite frequently. Now, this adaptation of the book strays extremely far from the source material. In fact, almost nothing the same. Dr. Frankenstein is actually called Dr. Stein, and he's not even our main character. Our protagonist is a different doctor named Dr. Winifred Walker. Now, Dr. Walker is a female doctor whose fiance lost his arms and legs due to a mine exploding in Vietnam. And so she went to her old mentor, Dr. Stein, to see if he could help him. Because in this version, Dr. Stein is less of a mad scientist and more of a medical Willy Wonka. He even has a Nobel Prize for his work. All of his experiments are extremely successful, and he is doing good things with science. He's working on a cure for aging, and a cure for removing scars. And he's not evil in the slightest. Now, in this version, Dr. Stein does in fact have an assistant, like always, but in this version, the assistant is a guy named Malcolm. And Malcolm falls in love with Dr. Walker. But she explains to him, she's in love with her fiance. That causes Malcolm to turn evil and try to sabotage Dr. Stein's experiments. Mainly the one that he is performing on Dr. Walker's fiance. Because in this adaptation, and this is probably the biggest change, they are not reanimating the dead. They are reattaching arms and legs to Dr. Walker's fiance. And it actually works. However, due to Malcolm's sabotaging of the experiments, the arms and legs that Malcolm had been given, which work properly now, he, a normal man, is slowly becoming a monster. This poor man who has become a monster kills a dog, he kills a bunch of people. He kills Malcolm, Dr. Stein. The monster pretty much kills every single person in this movie except for his fiance, Dr. Walker. And then the monster gets eaten by Rottweilers and dies. The best way to explain this adaptation is that it's the end of a long game of telephone with the story Frankenstein. There's a love story in there, but it's not with Dr. Frankenstein and Elizabeth. It's with the creature and some other doctor. And Dr. Frankenstein isn't called Dr. Frankenstein, it's Dr. Stein. And he isn't even evil. His assistant is evil. And this isn't a story that plays on ego. It's a story about jealousy. And a body doesn't get reanimated from the dead. An amputee gets new limbs. It's all just slightly different. But what really makes this movie fascinating is that it came out in 1973. America was retreating from Vietnam. And this movie is about a Vietnam veteran who comes back home and becomes a monster. This is a very thinly veiled metaphor for PTSD, which I think is a really cool way and interesting take on adapting the story. Telling a story that at that point, the release of this movie, that story had been around for over 100 years. but they adapted it to make it about issues that were very current in the climate that they were experiencing. Now, people don't really like that movie. They didn't like it when it came out. They still don't really like it. However, I will say I do think it was a good reason to adapt the movie, and therefore I'm going to say that it is a good adaptation. The next film on the list is called Frankenstein. And this Frankenstein also came out in 1973. This one, however, has a very different approach. While we've gotten touches of Frankenstein being treated as a drama instead of just a monster movie, such as in The Curse of Frankenstein, which was the second movie we watched in this video, this is the first adaptation that doesn't treat it like a monster movie, it treats it like a literary classic. When I was growing up, Frankenstein was taught to us as a school book. You know, this was something in the same vein as Charles Dickens or Shakespeare. This isn't a horror movie, this is literature. And this is the first adaptation that really leans into that. This movie is extremely grounded. The monster even looks way more human and realistic than any of the previous. And before we start breaking down the differences in this adaptation from the book, it's important to point out that this is by far the most faithful adaptation to the book that we have seen thus far. It's almost identical to the original story with only a few key details changed here or there, probably due to production or budget reasons. This film starts with Dr. Victor Frankenstein reading his report to a classroom full of his peers. They start rioting over this paper, calling him a heretic and that it's morally wrong. We then follow Victor Frankenstein to his study where his two assistants are already waiting for him. His assistants are named Otto and Hugo. And they're pretty much already done with their experiment. They're only in need of two things: a heart and a storm. Which, that brings us to one of the biggest differences in this adaptation, and that is the fact that Frankenstein has two assistants. Most movies only have one, and the book had zero. And in this version, while Frankenstein and his two assistants are in the graveyard looking for a heart, a security guy shoots one of the assistants. So this assistant has been shot, and they can't save him. So might as well use his heart for their monster that they've been building for the past several months. They do conveniently get a storm pretty soon after that, and we get the classic "it's alive" scene. Now, usually this is the part of the story where Dr. Frankenstein regrets creating the monster that he just made, but not in this one. He's not disgusted. He doesn't run away and flee. He's excited. And it isn't until the monster accidentally hugs his remaining living assistant to death that he thinks, okay, this might be a problem. He tries to shoot the monster in the head, but the monster is so childlike that he can't do it. Which brings us to another pretty big part of this adaptation. This is the first adaptation we've seen where it really builds a lot of sympathy for the monster. We do not hate this monster. We are not afraid of this monster. We feel bad for the monster, which, you know, is the whole point of the story. And this adaptation lets us live with the monster for a really long time. We see the monster learn. We see the monster understand. There's this really beautiful scene where the monster accidentally kills a bird, the same way that he accidentally killed one of the assistants, Otto, you know, by squeezing it too tight. And we get a moment where the monster understands death. And he has a realization that he has caused death. You know, and then we also see him rip someone's arm off. So, you know, give and take. We get the whole plot line from the book about the blind man. But in this version, it's a man who has a blind daughter. And the blind daughter has a brother who comes home. And the brother brings his wife with him. And the wife doesn't speak English. She comes from a Spanish-speaking country, so she's having to learn English. So the blind girl is teaching her brand new sister-in-law how to speak English. And the monster is listening in on the lessons, and now the monster is learning English. So that is different from the original. I think it's a pretty cool way to adapt that storyline. You know, it's different, but it achieves the same goal. The monster is learning. Now, this adaptation does something from the book that we haven't seen in any of the other adaptations. And that is the story arc where Dr. Frankenstein makes a friend slash partner for the monster. So we get to see a part of the book that we have not seen adapted so far, which made this movie stand out as a pretty different adaptation than what we've seen so far. The ending of this movie, however, is different. Elizabeth is not killed by the monster. Dr. Frankenstein accidentally dies by falling. The monster is heartbroken by the death of Frankenstein and gets shot and killed shortly thereafter. So, while all of this is different from the original story, mostly because we don't get the whole ship captain and the Arctic thing, it is pretty similar to some of the adaptations that we have seen thus far. So, it felt like a solid ending. This adaptation played with all of the themes from the book and really didn't stray far from it. So, by definition, this is probably the best adaptation of the book that we've gotten so far, just in the sense of it's pretty much identical to the book. I'm not gonna lie, it's not the most entertaining adaptation that we've seen on this list. I mean, who could forget Blackenstein? But it did feel like a breath of fresh air after watching the previous movies. This one did feel very different. Moving on. Frankenweenie. He must be a celebrity in the dog world. Now, this is the version of Frankenweenie that came out in 1984, the live-action version. Tim Burton, who is the director of this movie, would also go on to make a pretty much shot-for-shot remake of this same movie in stop motion later on. I wasn't even sure if I should include this movie in this video, mostly because Frankenweenie is more so based on the 1931 Universal Pictures Frankenstein movie than it is on the book. It's a lot like Young Frankenstein that we talked about earlier in the video, but I did want to at least mention it because this is a Frankenstein adaptation that takes a really unique and cool direction. It's about a teenage boy who brings his dog back to life, which makes the film less about ego and mad science, and it's more about love. Even in the ending of this film, when the townspeople accidentally kill the dog again, they realize that they were the ones that were wrong, and they help bring the dog back to life again. This movie is all about losing a loved one at a young age and understanding death, which I think is a great way and a great reason to adapt the story. So, I don't have a whole bunch to say about this one. I just wanted to bring it up.
Sting. Jennifer Beals. The Bride.
I have another quick mention for a movie from 1985 called The Bride. Once again, I wasn't sure if I should even include this movie because it's not based on the book. A majority of this movie is an imagining of what would happen if the book continued. Like if the original book had just a little bit of a different ending that wasn't so definite and just kept going. In this adaptation, Dr. Frankenstein is making a bride for the monster. But then, instead of Frankenstein destroying the new creature because he knows it's wrong, he succeeds and actually makes her very beautiful and actually improves on the imperfections of the first creature, making almost an exact replica of a human being, and, just like every man, falls in love with her. And the whole movie is just about the drama that surrounds Dr. Frankenstein being in love with her. She doesn't know what a cat is, and so he takes her to a fancy ball and there's a cat there and it freaks her out, and now he's embarrassed because she's acting like a child. The whole thing ends with the monster killing Frankenstein, and then the monster and the female monster run off together. Happily ever after. So again, not really an adaptation, it's more of like a continuation. So yeah, just another quick mention, moving on to our next adaptation. Frankenstein, 1992. Now this movie is named just Frankenstein, a lot like the others. This one just happened to come out in 1992. It's not like the whole Frankenstein 1970 thing where that's the title even though it came out 20 years before. And we are officially in the era of Frankenstein movies that treat it like a literary classic adaptation. Playing the monster in Frankenstein has become like playing Hamlet. It's a role worthy of showing off your ability, It's like the Joker. Now, this version actually takes a giant step away from every adaptation we have watched so far by actually starting off in the Arctic. A sea captain and his crew run into Dr. Frankenstein. A sea captain and his crew run into Dr. Frankenstein and the monster fighting to the death. They save Frankenstein, and he tells them the story of how he created the monster. And now, they are all in grave danger. For the most part, it's a pretty identical adaptation, and not very different from the 1973 adaptation we just watched. One of the biggest differences, however, is that the monster is a somewhat clone of Dr. Frankenstein, and they have like a psychic connection with each other. So that is a cool difference that sets it apart just a little bit, but for the most part, there's not too much more to say. And the only thing that will really be setting them apart, since the plots are so similar, are, performances. And when it comes to performances, this adaptation is nothing to write home about or to YouTube about. So when it comes to this adaptation, I would rather watch the 1973 version than this one. They're very similar, so if I was going to watch one, I would probably watch the 1973 one, which was very identical to this one. It's just that one was a little bit more entertaining for my taste. I have been talking a lot in this part of the video where Frankenstein makes a big switch from being a monster movie to a literary classic adaptation. And no movie proves this point more than the one that we're about to talk about, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was directed and starring Kenneth Branagh.
Kenneth Branagh.
Branagh. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was directed and starring Kenneth Branagh. Now, this is the same director and actor who adapted a lot of the Shakespeare plays. He was Hamlet, and he was in Much Ado About Nothing, and he was in King Henry, and then like Othello. Yeah, Henry V and Othello. Now, a lot of people consider this adaptation to be the adaptation of the book, but it does have some key differences. And its star power and performances do set it apart. You have Robert De Niro in this movie as the monster. Elizabeth is played by Helena Bonham Carter. This is the first time that we're seeing some really big stars in a Frankenstein movie. Now, when it comes to differences in the plot, however, there really aren't that many, but we'll break those down. It starts in the Arctic with the ship captain. Just like in the book, Victor Frankenstein does not have an assistant, just like in the book. We spend a lot of time in Victor's childhood, his school years. It doesn't just start in the middle of the story where he is creating the monster. But some of the key differences is that he's not motivated by ego in this adaptation. He's not motivated by the desire to be a genius in this adaptation. He is motivated by the loss of his mother and a professor who mentored him. Death is too much for him to handle, and he works so hard to try and defeat death so that he never has to lose a loved one ever again. Even the way that Kenneth Branagh plays Victor Frankenstein sets it apart so much from every adaptation we've seen. He plays him childlike and kind. He isn't a pretentious, cold asshole the entire time. We get to see a slow descent into madness caused by the grief of his loved ones. We see him justify grave robbing to himself. He's like, I'm just gathering raw materials. Another fun change is that the story takes place during the plague. We see bodies just lying around on the side of the street. As Victor Frankenstein is chasing the cure to death, we get to see the monster kill a landlord. So mad respect. And then one of the biggest changes that this adaptation makes from the story is the ending. The monster does kill Elizabeth, like in the story. In this version though, he rips her heart out. But Victor Frankenstein brings her back to life. The plotline in the book where Victor goes to create another creature for the monster as a partner, it gets replaced with him bringing his own wife back to life. But then she dies again, and then this ending is pretty faithful to the book. So it's like, just a couple extra steps, but we got to the same place. And I really enjoyed this adaptation. This is the movie that I would put on if someone was like, hey, I've never read Frankenstein, I don't feel like reading. Is there a good movie version? I really love how they portray the monster. I love how melodramatic it is. It's very theatrical, almost like an opera. That was a lot of the criticism that the movie got when it came out. People didn't like how theatrical and operatic it was. I mean, in this version, we see a shirtless, shredded Victor Frankenstein sprinting through his laboratory, covered in sweat, as he creates the monster, not with lightning, no, but with electric eels, which I think is badass. But other people thought it was a bit too much. I would personally rank this adaptation as my favorite. Well, maybe top 3. It's up there with the 1931 one for sure. Anyway, I'm curious if any of the adaptations left on our list to watch will even come close to this one. Well, there's only one way to find out. Frankenstein, 2004. Now, technically, this version is a 3-hour-long miniseries, but it is by far the most faithful adaptation that you could possibly get. There are so little changes in this, we're gonna call it a 3-hour-long movie, that there's not even really much to talk about. We've already, the story of Frankenstein. This is almost a line-for-line, bar-for-bar adaptation. In fact, this is actually the version of Frankenstein that I watched in English class when I was in high school. And I really enjoyed the design of the monster in this one. Not just the design too, the performance of the monster in this one I think is really standout as well. In fact, it might be my favorite depiction of the monster in any adaptation we've seen. Usually when we're watching these movies, Victor Frankenstein is the standout performance. Not in this one. The monster steals the show, which is ironic because it's his show. I mean, I say he might not be my favorite. The Boris Karloff from 1931, probably my favorite. But, it's up there. I do want to point out, however, that even though this is the most faithfully adapted version, I think I do prefer Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that movie, over watching this one. This one is just so faithful to the book that it can at times be a bit boring. But that being said, I have watched like 12 Frankenstein movies in a row at this point, so I could just be like, I know the story. Anyway, big fan, moving on. Frankenstein from 2015. Again, 2015 is the year that the movie came out. The name of the movie is just Frankenstein. Now, this movie is something that I would have thought that we had seen a ton of by now, which is this is a modern telling of the Frankenstein story. Victor Frankenstein and his wife Elizabeth are scientists who created Adam, which is the name of the monster in this film. Now, this adaptation follows the same kind of beats as the book, however, with some major modern retelling. We see Adam, the monster, kill some cops because they shot his dog, which, if we're being honest, makes him more like John Wick. And then there's the blind man who teaches the monster. In this version, he's a blind homeless man. So again, pretty much the same, just a little bit more modernized. This is a guy living on the streets. Now, this is where some major changes happen. Unless I missed a big part of the book, it's pretty different that in this movie, the homeless guy makes Adam, the monster, hook up with a prostitute who he then accidentally kills. So, not exactly what Mary Shelley wrote in 1818. We see the monster, who again is named Adam, use a GPS to locate his creator's home. He shoots more cops, by the way. He attacks his creators. Elizabeth tries to keep her husband Victor from decapitating the monster, which causes Victor to accidentally kill Elizabeth. And then Victor runs away, so he doesn't get convicted for the killing of his wife. And then that causes the monster to grab Elizabeth's body. And then he runs out into the woods and he yells, "I am Adam!" Gonna be honest, not my favorite adaptation, but I do think it is an effective adaptation of making it a modern story. So, we're not really ranking these or anything. Thumbs up, dude. And that brings us to our most recent and final Frankenstein movie on this list, which comes with a very big technicality. This movie is not an adaptation of Frankenstein. Not really. It's telling the story of Frankenstein's assistant, Igor, and like what his life is like as the assistant of a man who creates a monster. The big issue with this being an adaptation of the book is that in the book, Frankenstein doesn't have an assistant. And even in some of the adaptations of the book, Igor is not an assistant. The first time we meet the character Igor, and that is Igor with a Y, not an I, is in the 1939 Frankenstein sequel, Son of Frankenstein. It's a character that isn't an assistant or doesn't really have any of the stereotypes that the Igor name has now. He's a criminal who has a broken neck who forces Frankenstein to bring the creature back to life. And then Igor's brain ends up getting put into the monster. But throughout the years, pop culture has taken different characters from the Frankenstein zeitgeist and morphed them all into one character called Igor. The movie Young Frankenstein, which we've talked about is a parody of the classic Frankenstein movies, was the first movie to use Igor with an I in this way. And then it just kept happening again and again until we have a Frankenstein adaptation about a character that's not in the original story. Now, the reason I'm even bringing this movie up is because it's starring Daniel Radcliffe and James McAvoy. And it's a pretty big studio film that came out in the last 10 years. And even if you didn't see this movie, when you were watching this video, if I didn't bring it up, you'd be like, what the fuck happened to the one with Daniel Radcliffe? Wasn't Harry Potter in a Frankenstein movie? So I thought it would be a shame if I didn't at least mention this movie in the list. We've included it on the list, but it really shouldn't be here. There are hundreds and hundreds of movies that involve the character of Frankenstein's monster. But when it comes to adaptations of the book, this is it. We saw versions that strayed very far from the book but still made for very entertaining films, like Blackenstein. We saw versions that were almost a page-for-page adaptation from the book, like Frankenstein's miniseries from 2004. We saw versions that took the basic premise and then did something different entirely, like Frankenstein 1970. And we even saw a children's family movie version with Frankenweenie. So the question that we set out to answer in this video was, why do they make so many adaptations of Frankenstein? And I think we found the answer. The themes of ego, pride, ambition, abandonment, loneliness, need for human connection and friends and family means that you could really make a million different versions of this story. Like if you watched the 2023 movie Poor Things, that is a Frankenstein movie. It's not directly adapted from the book, but it is very obviously a Frankenstein story. This year, 2024, a movie called Lisa Frankenstein came out. It has Frankenstein in the name, and while it is not an adaptation of the book, it is a Frankenstein movie. And that's because this story has something for everyone to relate to. 100 different filmmakers can tell this story, and it would be different every single time. Because that's the thing, even in the adaptations we watched that were almost exactly identical to the book, they still played with different themes. Some of them focused on the warning of too much ambition. Some focused on the loss of a loved one and handling that grief. Some just focused on the cool visuals of bringing a monster to life. Some focused on the story between a creator and its creation. It's the same story, but it means something different to everyone that watches it or makes a YouTube video watching all of them.